One event can cause an election to spin out of control. Neil Kinnock falling into the sea. Was that the reason that Labour lost the 92 election? It may well have been. May well have been. It's not certain. But one event, one significant televised event, and Neil Kinnock, who had not really warmed himself to the general public, was eclipsed by John Major. John Major, of all people. It's not that John Major won that election. It's that Neil Kinnock lost it, because John Major was expected to lose. And could Keir Starmer go the same way? Andrew Marr thinks that the thing that could destroy Keir Starmer's chances of securing the next election, and let's face it, that next election is literally in his hands, could well be Keir Starmer's attitude to the Israel-Gaza situation, his failure to call for a ceasefire, or failure to explain what a ceasefire means. A ceasefire is part of a process towards peace. So failing to call for a ceasefire and failing equally to call for peace is his mistake. So calling for a humanitarian corridor, calling for a pause is as bad, actually, as calling for a ceasefire. The goal is peace. The means of achieving that goal, the solutions, are diverse. I've done another video pointing out why I think calling for a ceasefire at the moment is more likely to drive Netanyahu into intransigence and greater resistance to any form of peace deal than keeping silent. I think we should be calling for the gates of Gaza to be open. I think we should be calling for Israel to demonstrate its commitment to humanitarian ideals, to the humanitarian ideals that any civilized country embraces, the humanitarian ideals that divide a civilized country from a terrorist organization, and so on. Calling for a ceasefire, I think, also stokes frustration at home. And that in turn, that frustration, drives more people towards the irrational and more ill-targeted frustration in terms of explosions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So we must measure our language and our demands to what can be achieved and what is useful, while allowing for a clear commentary. So that clear commentary would involve opinion and criticizing and so on. So as we might consider, is there a just military response to terrorism? That's one question. The second question is the Israeli siege of Gaza that just military response? So there are two questions there right at the beginning. You could reject one and accept the other. Like many people, I respect the right to a country's self-defense, but I think that Israel's siege of Gaza is not exactly the right form of self-defense. I think that Israel commanded the support and sympathy of the worldwide community on the 7th of October, and it squandered that in its knee-jerk military response. A much better approach to Israel's siege of Gaza would have been an international boots on the ground. That may have taken a little longer, but I don't think the Hamas people were going to go anywhere. That's not what we're dealing with now. and we can't push the clock back and start dealing with what ifs and all this sort of recrimination. We have to deal with the reality. There's real people's lives at stake. Israel exists because the US and the UK and other countries imposed border controls after World War II in the follow-up of the Holocaust horror. And Jewish people were desperate to leave Germany, the Russia, the Poland, the places where they had felt under threat, those who survived. They weren't going to be able to come to the US or to the UK. Israel became a serious alternative. That's all about what would Suella Braverman have called it? Protecting our borders. So you can't have it both ways. If refugees cannot settle in the UK or the US, then Israel becomes the de facto solution, backed up by the pre-war Zionist rhetoric and the quasi-legal formula of the Balfour Declaration. Not ideal in any way, but, it was good enough for the old guard of the Labour Party, for example, and we often think now that it's the Labour Party that opposes Israel and the Conservative Party that supports Israel, but that was not always the case. What changed? Tony Benn, the father of Hilary Benn, the grand man of the far left in Labour, he came out very early as an ardent Zionist. In 1956, Benn called Israel the miracle of a home for Jews after 1900 years of ghetto and pogrom, rooted in the soil of the kibbutzim to pass on the richly fertile ideas to future generations, or something like that. And then there were the let's say the offensive wars, the 1967 war with the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and perhaps more stridently the 1982 Lebanon war, which may have shifted public opinion, and certainly shifted public opinion in the Labour Party. And of course, with the new century, we ended up with a new form of politics in Israel. Netanyahu is definitely not a socialist. He faces corruption charges and political pressure domestically. In the months before the terrorist outrage on October the 7th, it was as if the whole of society was marching through the streets towards Netanyahu. Did he pay any attention to those marches? No, of course not. But today, it is the war which has become his political survival, as well as his emotional response to the terror outrage. There's something else which has changed political opinion, or particularly political opinion in the left, towards support of Israel, and that's as the memory of the Holocaust has receded, the feeling of support for Israel and the sense of injustice done to the Jewish people has receded. It's no longer as realistic, it's no longer as memorable. It is memorable to the Jewish people. And this sense of the sense of betrayal and sense of fear when people are marching in the streets for Palestine and letting off smoke canisters directly outside a synagogue must be utterly terrifying. Equally utterly terrifying is the inability of people to be able to distinguish between support for Palestine, support for the civilians who are under such threat, and the ideology of Hamas and Hezbollah, which is evil and inhumane and calling for the eradication of Israel. The eradication of Israel is an abhorrent idea. But the future needs to be based on a political accord between Israel and Palestine, between Israel and the Arab world. It needs to involve de-armament, peace, and a realistic prospect of genuine security. And without that, nothing is possible. But finding that and finding the language to accept that is going to be very hard. Now, as I say, because I really intended to talk about the Labour Party and also possibly even the Conservative Party. There are communities around the country where the Muslim communities have recorded, have noted, apparently, what has been said by each political leader, each constituency MP, and there is a general movement towards setting up independent candidates at the next election that would, of course, weaken the possibility of Keir Starmer getting a clear majority in some of those constituencies. It may just be 20 or 30 of the constituencies, but 20 or 30 constituencies that swing back to the Conservatives rather than to Labour could be the difference between a certain Labour victory at the moment and, quite surprisingly and astonishingly, a Conservative victory instead. And I cannot believe I'm changing my mind now, but that threat, which Keir Starmer has embraced because of the lack of clarity in his call for, in his failure to call for a ceasefire, in his failure to leap onto that sloganizing bandwagon. He is quite right, by the way, but he is wrong not to explain what he's talking about. And because he, like so many politicians in today's world, cannot seem to articulate anything other than a stream of slogans himself, he's replacing one slogan with another slogan. If it's the sloganizing he doesn't like, he has to stop sloganizing. He has ceded a serious challenge to the next election, which I thought would be in the bag. Now, of course, it's not only Labour seats which are going to be compromised by these independent candidates. It's also Conservative seats. And the question is, would they swing to Labour if they were, let's say, borderline red wall seats? Could they swing back to Labour? Well, I don't know. So it just depends on the Muslim vote. But I remember back in the day, I remember friends in Keighley in Yorkshire telling me how the Catholic priests got out in force and stopped. I think it was a Conservative vote at the time because they didn't like the attitude of the then incumbent Conservative MP to some of the social issues. And a religious vote can genuinely affect the outcome of an election. And I think Keir Starmer should bear that in mind.